On the afternoon of March 24th, 2006, an employee at a moving truck rental company in Ohio opened his desk drawer and grabbed a wad of cash. It had been a slow day, so the employee was using his downtime to organize a few recent payments. The money he had just grabbed was from an all-cash deal that had happened a few days ago. At the time, the employee had been super busy, so he'd just taken the cash from the customer, flipped through it quickly to make sure the amount seemed right, then shoved the money in the drawer to deal with later. Now he was actually counting it properly, and he really hoped the customer had not shorted him, or he would have to track them down to collect the rest. But as the employee counted the bills, he paused, not because the amount wasn't right, but because there was something on the money that caught his attention. For a second, he wasn't sure what it was, so he looked closer, and then all at once he understood what he was seeing. He stopped counting the money and just began flipping through it as quickly as he could, and he kept seeing the same thing on almost all the bills. With his heart racing, the employee just dropped the money, grabbed the phone, and called the police. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to cut the follow button's grass for them. But set the blade so low that it just obliterates the grass and leaves only dirt. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Thursday, March 9, 2006, a 50-year-old woman named Karen Diable Bliss sat in the passenger seat of her car. Her husband, 71-year-old Jim Diable Bliss, was behind the wheel driving them through downtown Lancaster, Ohio. Karen looked out the window and watched as they passed historic buildings, shops, and restaurants. Every once in a while, Jim slowed down and waved to people on the sidewalk because young Karen knew practically everybody in town. Lancaster was a small suburb of about 36,000 people, and it was generally a friendly, blue-collar place. Karen and Jim had lived there for over a decade, and they were well known in the community, mostly because of their business ventures. They owned multiple rental properties around town and also a store where they sold electronics, toys, and hobby supplies. The properties in the store had not only made Karen and Jim a lot of friends, but also a lot of money. They had a reputation for being very wealthy, but also very generous. They went out of their way to help people who were down on their luck, especially friends and family. Karen's former sister-in-law, whose name was Diana Smith, had actually been living in one of their rental properties for a long time now, and Karen's son was an employee at their store. But even now, with all of their success and their kindness, Karen knew that a lot of people in town viewed her and Jim as kind of an odd couple. They'd both been married before and had kids from their first marriages, and on paper, they didn't seem like obvious partners. Jim was 21 years older than Karen, and he also tended to be pretty quiet and reserved. Karen, on the other hand, was usually the loudest person in the room. But despite their differences, they just worked, and really, that was all that mattered to them. Just then, Karen felt the car slow to a stop. She looked out the window and saw that they were at their first stop of the evening, the hobby store that they owned. There was a big sign outside that said the store's name, DD Sales. The sign looked exceptionally bright and clean, which should have made Karen happy, but in reality, it actually made her feel kind of annoyed. The sign had recently been repainted by Karen and Jim's regular handyman, and he'd done a great job with it. And Karen had paid him what she owed him for the work, but then, after she paid him, he kept demanding more money. Now Karen prided herself on being generous, but she'd felt like the handyman was now trying to take advantage of her. So, she had told him that if he wanted to earn more money, she could give him another repair job. Now ultimately he had agreed to do another job, but he'd made it very clear that he was not happy about it, and things had been tense between him and Karen ever since. But, luckily, the handyman was not at the store that day. Karen was actually here to see somebody else, her 27-year-old son, Jeremy Moore. She could see him inside the shop through the window, manning the front counter. He was tall, skinny, and had dark hair and earrings. Jeremy was her only son from her first marriage, and they usually got along really well. When Karen and Jim first opened DD's Sales, they'd given Jeremy a job, and he'd been a great employee. Karen had felt like she could really trust him, and she'd given him a lot of independence. But then that all changed, because Jeremy had started getting into serious trouble. He'd never really been a troublemaker, but it was like all of a sudden he had gotten arrested for stealing. And when he came back to work after that, his performance had majorly slipped. He'd started showing up late or not showing up at all. And on top of that, some of Karen and Jim's other store employees had begun complaining that they didn't like working with him because he was moody and angry. And so this had put Karen in a pretty awkward position because she loved Jeremy and she wanted him to succeed. And family or not, she just wasn't in the habit of firing people or leaving them high and dry when they were having a hard time. But at the same time, she also didn't want Jeremy's attitude and performance to affect her business. So she had sort of made it a point to check in on him while he was working. Karen told Jim she'd be right back, and she got out of the car. She went inside the store and asked her son how he was doing, and he seemed annoyed to be asked and just told her that, everything was fine. So Karen did a quick sweep of the store to make sure all the shelves were stocked and the aisles were clean. Everything looked good. So she went back to the front counter and told Jeremy she loved him, and then headed back outside to the car. A few minutes later, Karen and Jim pulled up to their second stop of the evening, their favorite bowling alley, which was called Tiki Lanes. In addition to being business people, Karen and Jim were avid bowlers. They were in 3 different bowling leagues and came to Tiki Lanes at least a few times a week. In fact, they were so serious about bowling that they'd even hired a coach who they met with for weekly lessons. But for tonight, they were just here to meet with their friends for a couple of casual rounds. Karen and Jim parked the car, walked inside, and went straight to their usual lane. A bunch of their bowling friends were already sitting around tables nearby, and when they saw Karen and Jim, they got up and hugged and said hello. At some point, Karen sat down, put on her bowling shoes, and took several expensive rings off her fingers and stuck them in her pockets so they wouldn't get damaged. Then she got up and got ready to play. Throughout the evening, Jim kept the table stocked with snacks and drinks for the whole group. They ate, they drank, they played, and they talked with their friends. And by the time they were all done, Karen was exhausted. She put her rings back on, changed her shoes, and all she could think about was getting home and going to bed. So she and Jim said goodbye to everyone, then they went outside, hopped in their car, and headed home. About 10 minutes later, they pulled into their driveway. They lived in a big brick house in a rural area north of town, so the neighborhood was quiet and scenic. Karen got out of the car and was about to walk to the door, but she stopped when she heard a voice call up to her from behind her, from behind her. She turned around and she gasped. 4 days later, around 9 Jeroam on Monday, March 13th, Karen's son Jeremy pulled up outside his mother and stepfather's house. He parked his red sedan, then got out and walked towards the front door. So normally at this time, Jeremy would be opening up the family store, DD's Sales, but he'd asked another person to keep an eye on the store because he needed to go see his mom. He had a routine of calling her every morning when he got to work, but that morning when he called, she hadn't picked up, which was unusual. And then Jeremy realized that he actually hadn't spoken to his mother that entire weekend, and normally they spoke just about every day. So the whole situation made him feel confused and sort of concerned. Jeremy went to the front door and he knocked, but he didn't hear anything inside. Nobody came to the door, and he called out for his mom, but he didn't hear anybody calling him back. So eventually he reached down and tried the handle, and he discovered it was unlocked. And when he swung the door open, nothing happened, which was also unusual. Jeremy knew his mom and stepdad never left the door unlocked, and they also had an alarm system. So the alarm at this point should have been going off right now, but it wasn't held. Once Jeremy was inside, he looked over at the living room and he saw it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned and papers and random items were scattered all over the floor. At this point, Jeremy's heart was racing because obviously something was wrong. Instinctively, he just ran away to his mother and stepfather's bedroom. But when he got there, something inside of him told him not to go all the way into the room. Instead, he sort of peered around the door frame to barely look inside. And when he did, he saw it was a mess just like the living room. Drawers had been pulled open, and there were clothes and empty jewelry boxes all over the floor. But also on the floor, in the middle of this mess, Jeremy saw a big red puddle that he immediately knew was blood. And in this puddle, he saw 2 feet. And even though from his vantage point, peering into this room barely, Jeremy couldn't really see anything except those 2 feet. He just had this immediate gut feeling that the feet belonged to his mother and that she had been murdered. Jeremy turned, sprinted out of the house, and called the police. A few minutes later, a young, stocky detective named Scott Jones arrived on the scene along with several other police officers and a team of forensic investigators. There were so many first responder vehicles crowded around the area that he had to park his squad car a little ways down the road. Detective Jones got out of his car and began walking towards the big brick house. He was here to investigate. He had worked for the county sheriff's office for about 4 years, and in that time he had investigated homicide cases, and he knew how important it was to approach every crime scene with a very open mind. So he was coming in with 0 preconceived notions. All he knew at this point was that a few minutes ago, a young man named Jeremy had called in to report the murder of his mother, Karen Diable Bliss. He also knew that the big brick house belonged to Karen and her husband, Jim, but right now Detective Jones didn't know where Jim was. Jeremy hadn't said anything about him when he called in the report. As Detective Jones walked, he noticed that in the midst of all the emergency response vehicles, there was also a civilian car parked on the road. It was a red sedan, and there was a thin man with dark hair and earrings sitting inside of it. Detective Jones assumed it must be Jeremy. Detective Jones took note of this and just continued towards the home's driveway. There he met up with a slightly older detective with a handlebar mustache whose name was Andy Roberts. Detective Jones and Detective Roberts shook hands, and then together they approached the front door. Detective Jones noticed that the door did not look damaged at all, like it had not been pried or broken open. In fact, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. To Detective Jones, this meant that whoever killed Karen either had a key to the house or Karen had let them inside, and so this suggested that she had some kind of personal relationship with her killer. Still, Detective Jones reminded himself not to jump to any conclusions. He and the other detective went inside and right away saw the living room had been totally ransacked. It looked like a robbery, but again, Jones didn't want to form an opinion before seeing all the evidence. Because the house was so big, the detectives agreed to split up and examine rooms of the house separately. Detective Jones took the bedroom, where he already knew the body was located. And when he got there, he saw the room was a total disaster, just like the living room. And on the floor, he saw Karen Diable Bliss lying face down in a pool of blood. The detective could see her body was covered in dozens of stab wounds, and when Jones leaned down for a better look, he saw that she also had cuts all over her hands. This told the detective two things. First, whoever killed Karen did so in a particularly violent and aggressive way, which suggested they were extremely upset with her. And the defensive wounds on Karen's hand suggested that she very likely fought back against her attacker. And so at this point, Detective Jones began to wonder about Jim, Karen's husband. He knew that statistically women were most likely to be killed by their intimate partners, so it seemed possible that Jim might have murdered Karen, then staged the house to look like it had been robbed, and then he fled. Detective Jones began asking the crime scene techs to take photos of Karen's body, as well as the empty jewelry boxes all around the room, and as he was doing this, suddenly, he heard Detective Roberts call out to him from a different part of the house. He sounded startled, and he yelled for Detective Jones to hurry. Seconds later, Detective Jones was standing by Roberts as they both stared down a set of stairs into the basement. And lying at the bottom of those stairs, they could see there was a second body. When they went down the stairs, the detective saw that the body belonged to a man. He was on his back, and he had also been stabbed dozens of times, and he was just around the corner from a closet which had an empty, open safe inside of it. Detective Jones realized that they had just found Karen Diable Bliss's husband, Jim, and so this made his earlier idea that maybe Jim had killed his wife, Karen, seem highly unlikely. And even though he still didn't want to jump to conclusions, a theory was already beginning to take shape in his mind. Based on the missing jewelry, the open safe, and the ransacked home, This was most likely a real robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But Detective Jones was hung up on one detail. There was no evidence of forced entry into the house. So the perpetrator either had access to the home, possibly with a key, or Karen or Jim had opened the door for their killer. After he was done investigating the crime scene, Detective Jones went outside to speak to the 911 caller who was sitting inside of his car. The man, who appeared very shaken, confirmed that his name was Jeremy Moran, that the woman inside was his mother. Detective Jones informed Jeremy that his stepfather, Jim, was also found dead inside of the home. And when Jeremy heard this, he just went silent and kind of stared off into space. Detective Jones couldn't tell if he was shocked or just pretending to be. So, he asked Jeremy why he'd come to his parents' house that day. Jeremy said that when he'd gone into work that morning, he had called his mother to check in like he always did, but she hadn't answered. He also said the last time he had seen his mom was 4 days earlier, on Thursday evening, when she and Jim had stopped by the hobby store on their way to go bowling at Tiki Lanes. Detective Jones then asked Jeremy about the contents of the house and what might have been taken. Jeremy told him that his mother did have a lot of jewelry, but he didn't know where she kept it all. And he also said he had no idea who would have done something like this. Detective Jones knew that it was way too soon to confirm or eliminate Jeremy as a suspect. He also didn't know when the couple had died, so he couldn't determine if Jeremy had an alibi yet. So for now, he told Jeremy he was free to go. Detective Jones watched Jeremy drive away, then he went back to the driveway to speak with Detective Roberts. They both agreed to keep an eye on Jeremy, but they also wanted to send a team of investigators to speak to neighbors and ask if anybody had seen or heard anything strange over the last few days. And while they did that, Jones decided he would go check out the bowling alley that Jeremy had mentioned. Later that day, Detective Jones walked inside of Tiki Lanes. He hoped the staff there would have some information for him because, so far, the investigative team had not gotten much from Karen and Jim's neighbors. Everyone they had spoken to had said they hadn't seen or heard anything weird, and they also hadn't seen Karen or Jim all weekend. Detective Jones went up to the front desk and explained why he was there, and a few of the employees said that they didn't know Karen and Jim, and they agreed to sit down with the detective and answer his questions. From these interviews, Detective Jones learned that Karen and Jim were regulars at Tiki Lanes and they were avid bowlers who'd hired a coach to improve their game. He also found out that Karen typically wore a lot of rings on her fingers, which was actually pretty significant to him because she wasn't wearing any rings when she was found. Whoever had killed her very likely had taken them right off her hands. Lastly, everyone Detective Jones spoke to at the bowling alley said that the last time they'd seen the couple was Thursday night. That was also the last time that Jeremy reported seeing them as well. So for now, Detective Jones decided to operate under the assumption that Karen and Jim had been killed Thursday, sometime after they had bowled at Tiki Lanes. And so based on that, he decided to call Jeremy in for a formal interview to ask him what he had done after he had left work on Thursday evening. The next day, Detective Jones sat in front of his computer inside of his office at the police station while he waited for Jeremy to show up for his interview. He was preparing for the interview by doing some research about Jeremy. Based on interviews the rest of the investigative team had done with Karen and Jim's friends, neighbors, and family members, Detective Jones had already learned a couple of very interesting things. First, Jeremy had reportedly stolen money and other items from Karen in the past. Second, Jeremy was in Karen's will and was going to inherit a lot of money now that she was dead. In the detective's mind, this seemed like a pretty clear motive for murder. It also struck him as very suspicious that Jeremy had been the one who found Karen's body and called the police. Detective Jones knew that it wasn't uncommon for murderers to return to the scene of a crime and to literally insert themselves into the investigation. Now on his computer, Detective Jones pulled up Jeremy's criminal record and scanned through his previous charges. He saw that Jeremy had been arrested for theft. Now, the detective knew there was a big difference between stealing and committing murder, but the fact that Jeremy had a documented history of theft and the fact that he was going to inherit a lot of money after his mother died looked really bad for him. So when Jeremy finally came in for his interview, Detective Jones was very eager to talk to him. He led Jeremy into an interview room and then sat down across from him. And just like the last time they had spoken, Jeremy struck the detective as seeming nervous and emotional. Detective Jones started by asking Jeremy what he had done on Thursday evening after he'd gotten off from work, and Jeremy said he'd gone straight home. But when Detective Jones asked if anybody could verify that, Jeremy said no one could. So, Detective Jones began pressing him much harder, asking him directly about his history of theft and also his mother's will. Jeremy admitted that he had made some mistakes in the past, but he swore he would never hurt his mother, whether he was in her will or not. He said this whole thing was just as confusing and upsetting for him as it was for everybody else. Now, Detective Jones wasn't sure if he actually believed Jeremy, but he still didn't have any evidence that would allow him to hold Jeremy in custody. So he let Jeremy go, and then once he was gone, the detective began heading back to his office. But on the way there, he ran into his partner, Detective Roberts, who looked excited. Roberts said he'd been going over statements the rest of the investigative team had collected from Karen's siblings, and there was someone that they really needed to speak to. A little while later, Detective Jones listened outside the door of an interrogation room as another detective was sitting with Karen's former sister-in-law, Diana Smith. Karen's brother Edgar had told police about Diana, who was his ex-wife. Edgar said that Karen had bought him and Diana a house in Lancaster where they lived with their 2 kids. But when Edgar and Diana got divorced, Edgar moved out, but Diana wanted to stay inside of the house. Now, Diana didn't have a lot of money after the divorce, so Karen had made an agreement with her. She could stay in the house if she paid a small fee each month and then also came to Karen's house weekly and cleaned it. It seemed like a win-win situation, but Diana almost never showed up to clean Karen's house like she had promised. So eventually, as a result of that, Karen increased her rent, and this had made Diana really mad and lead to a lot of tension between them. And when investigators had spoken to Karen's other siblings, they'd also learned that Diana loved jewelry and expensive things, even though she really couldn't afford them. So investigators had brought Diana in for an interview because someone who loved jewelry and disliked Karen was incredibly suspicious. Plus, if Diana did periodically clean Karen's house, well, she might have had a key or known the alarm system security code, which could explain why there was no evidence of forced entry. And so now Detective Jones stood there in the hallway and listened in. When the investigator in the room asked Diana about the rent increase in her cleaning arrangement with Karen, Diana said she didn't have any issues with Karen, which obviously was not true. Diana also said she did not have a key to Karen's house or know the code to their alarm, which seemed hard to believe if she was supposed to drop by weekly to their house to clean it. It just seemed like Diana was not being honest, but right now it was Diana's word against the rest of Karen's siblings, so police really couldn't hold her. Still, after she had left, Detective Jones kept thinking about the fact that Karen's siblings had really specifically mentioned that Diana truly loved jewelry. And so if Diana had stolen Karen's jewelry, she might have kept it, but she also might have pawned it since she needed the money. At this point, the investigative team already knew that Karen had a lot of expensive and unique pieces of jewelry that she typically bought at a specific local store. Authorities were already in touch with the shop owner, who was confident that she would actually recognize most of Karen's items. So, Detective Jones decided to start contacting pawn shops in Lancaster and the surrounding areas to see what jewelry had been sold between last Thursday and now. If any of it turned out to be Karen's, they might be able to find out exactly who would pawn it. On Wednesday, March 15th, 2006, so 2 days after Karen and Jim had been found dead, Detective Jones was at his desk when one of his investigators came in and dropped an itemized receipt in front of him. It was from a local pawn shop and was for the sale of an expensive piece of jewelry on Saturday, March 11th, just 2 days after Karen and Jim were killed. And when Detective Jones looked at the bottom of the paper, he gasped. The seller's name was written right there. It was Diana Smith, Karen's former sister-in-law. Detective Jones felt his heart pounding, but he tried to tell himself to be patient. Before they did anything else, they needed to be absolutely sure that the piece of jewelry Diana sold actually belonged to Karen. So, he told the officers to get the jewelry from the pawn shop. And the next day, Karen's regular jeweler came into the station to look at it, and she determined beyond a doubt that it was not Karen's. After the jeweler left, Detective Jones slumped in his desk chair and rubbed his eyes in frustration. Now, the fact that this pawn jewelry did not belong to Karen was definitely disappointing, but the detective also didn't think that proved Diana was innocent. She clearly needed money, otherwise why would she have pawned one of her own pieces? And they also had a lot of other clues that made her seem suspicious as well. Still, at this point, Detective Jones didn't really know where to turn. A whole team of detectives was investigating the case, but it felt like they just kept hitting dead end after dead end. He was still sure the motivation in this case had to be money. Karen and Jim's house had been ransacked and a lot of their valuables were missing, like Karen's jewelry. Even the rings she had on her hands had been taken. But the robbery didn't seem random. It had been targeted and deliberate. The killer had been able to access the house without breaking in, which meant they either had a key or Karen and Jim had let them in. And not only that, the couple was killed with such violence, it seemed like the killer was deeply angry with them. And there were the people who had a financial motive and potential access to the home: Karen's son, Jeremy, and her ex-sister-in-law, Diana. But Detective Jones hadn't found any concrete evidence to prove that Jeremy or Diana had committed this crime. And as he sat there going over the case in his mind, he knew there were a lot of other people in Karen and Jim's lives that the police had barely even looked into yet. They had friends from the bowling alley, plus multiple employees, tenants, and neighbors that interacted with them regularly. And these people knew Jim and Karen were wealthy, so basically, Karen and Jim seemed to have some kind of relationship with pretty much everybody in Lancaster. And so, Detective Jones had a whole lot more interviewing still left to do. About a week later, so 11 days after Karen and Jim's bodies were found, Detective Jones was sitting in his office feeling frustrated. His team had been going all over town interviewing basically everybody in Lancaster, and still, they had not gotten a single helpful tip. But that afternoon, Detective Jones's phone rang, and the best lead he'd gotten so far seemed to fall right into his lap. It was somebody from his department calling with a very interesting story. They said they just got a call from a guy who worked at a moving company in town. The employee said that a customer had come in, rented a truck, and paid him in cash a few days ago. And the employee said he had just begun counting their cash payment and he'd found something the police really needed to see. Detective Jones hung up the phone, grabbed his coat, and headed out to meet this guy. Before long, Detective Jones stood at an office counter across from the moving company employee, and they both were looking down at the cash the employee had mentioned on the phone call. And as Detective Jones was looking at it, he asked the employee to tell him everything he could remember about the person who had given him the cash. And the employee told him that a few days ago, he got into work early to set up for the day. But when he arrived, there were already some customers lined up by the door. And one of them had been carrying a heavy-looking plastic grocery bag and seemed very antsy to get inside. And they told the employee that they really needed to rent a truck for a move. The employee noticed that the customer looked exhausted and sort of scared. But the weirdest part about this whole encounter was that when it came time for the customer to pay for the rental, they'd opened up their shopping bag, and it was full of what looked like thousands of dollars in loose bills. It was definitely weird, but money was money. So the employee had accepted the cash and handed the customer the keys, and they'd gone on their way. It was not until later, when the employee had counted the cash from the sale, that he noticed a lot of the money was covered in blood. Detective Jones couldn't believe it. He asked the employee if he kept records of his customers' names and information. The employee walked over to a file cabinet, pulled out a particular piece of paper, and handed it to Detective Jones. It was a contract that all customers had to sign in order to rent a moving truck, and written on that contract was a name and an address. Detective Jones rushed back to the station and pored over the evidence once again. He wanted to make sure that every piece of information they had lined up with the person whose name was on that contract. And as far as he could see, it did. So he and Detective Roberts, along with some backup, went to the address the moving company had given them. And when they got there, they saw it was a mobile home. They charged up to the door and loudly announced themselves. Seconds later, the door opened and the detective saw not one, but two people standing in the doorway. And when Detective Jones looked behind these people into the mobile home, he knew immediately that these were the people who had killed Karen and Jim Diable Bliss. based on later confessions and evidence collected by investigators. Here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Karen and Jim Diablo Bliss on March 9, 2006. That evening, the killer was riding in the back seat of a car with a few other people. In one hand, they were holding a plastic grocery bag, and in their other hand, they were clutching a large kitchen knife. They were on their way to Karen and Jim's house. The killer had been planning to rob the couple for a while now. They'd even asked an accomplice to join them, and now one of their friends was driving them and their accomplice to the house. But as they got closer to the big brick home, the killer saw that all the lights were off and there was no car in the driveway. Karen and Jim were at home, and this was actually a big problem. The killer needed Karen and Jim to be home because they had an alarm system that would go off if the killer tried to break in. The killer also needed Jim and Karen around to open up their safe, which they knew was in the basement. And so now, since they weren't home, the killer decided the plan wouldn't work and they should just forget about it. So they told their friend who was driving to turn around. But as they began to drive away, they saw Karen and Jim pass them on the road, headed towards their house. At this point, the killer realized they could still go through with their plan, so they told the driver to turn around again. And a few moments later, they pulled up in front of the house, and the killer and the accomplice jumped out right as Karen and Jim were walking up their driveway. The killer called out to the couple, and when they turned around, the killer held up the knife. They told Karen and Jim to let them and their accomplice inside the house, or else. Karen and Jim were obviously terrified, so they did what the killer said. They went inside, and then the killer led Jim downstairs to the safe while the accomplice stayed upstairs and kept an eye on Karen. When the killer and Jim got to the safe, the killer held up the knife again and told Jim to open it. Jim did, and then the killer grabbed all the money that was inside and began shoving it into the grocery bag. But at some point, Jim tried to get away, and the killer knew they couldn't let him or they'd be caught in the middle of this robbery. So they didn't stop to think. They just started stabbing Jim over and over until he stopped moving. After that, the killer calmly walked upstairs where they found Karen and the accomplice, and they demanded that Karen show them where she kept her jewelry. When Karen said it was in her bedroom, the killer brought her in there. But at some point, Karen began to struggle with the killer and was knocked to the floor. And after that, the accomplice held onto Karen as the killer stabbed her over and over again. Karen did try to fight back, but it was too much and eventually, she also died. The killer and their accomplice spent the next hour raiding the home for valuables. When they got all they could carry, they ran back to the car waiting outside and fled with thousands and thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and antiques. The killer was not Karen's former sister-in-law Diana, and it wasn't Karen's son Jeremy. It was somebody else who did regularly work for the couple and who'd recently had an argument with them over how much money they were owed Dottie. The killer was Karen and Jim's handyman, 26-year-old Eric Hoeckelman. Eric had done a lot of odd jobs for the couple, including recently painting their store sign. But when Karen paid him for that work, Eric felt like she had given him less than he was owed, and this infuriated him, because he knew that Karen and Jim had a ton of money and also they had a lot of expensive things. And he knew this because he had done work at their house and seen these things. So he started planning a robbery. He asked a friend to give him a ride and then also enlisted his girlfriend, 29-year-old Heidi Kidwell, to be his accomplice. The friend agreed and also Heidi agreed, possibly because she was in the middle of a 3-week heroin high and was not thinking clearly. After the murders, Eric and Heidi laid low for a few days. Then, about 3 days after Karen and Jim's bodies were found, they rented a moving truck and left town. But their big mistake was paying for their rental with cash they had stolen from Karen and Jim, cash that was covered in the couple's blood. The moving company employee led the police straight to Eric and Heidi's new address, which was over 1,000 miles away in Key Largo, Florida. When authorities searched Eric and Heidi's mobile home, there they found thousands of dollars in cash along with expensive antiques, watches, and jewelry that was later identified as belonging to Karen. Eric and Heidi were both arrested and taken back to Ohio. Heidi pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Eric was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also received 67 additional years for kidnapping, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, and theft from an elderly person. The person who drove Eric and Heidi to commit the murders was never charged. Eric would die by suicide in jail in 2019. Heidi was released from prison in 2020 and passed away 2 years later at age 45. Today's story is one that I told several years ago back on YouTube, but during my 2024 live tour, I brought this one back out and gave it a complete overhaul and ended up telling it live, and the audience really liked it. The story is about a family, a father and his 2 daughters, whose lives are turned upside down after their mother passes away. But their grief would soon turn to horror as they began to hear tapping coming from their walls at night. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the Amazon Music follow button you're going to gift them tickets to my first ever live storytelling tour. But don't tell them you got them tickets that are mid-row, floor seats to the Indianapolis show. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the fall of 1996, Frank Bowen, along with his 2 daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So, Frank's wife and the girls' mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible. But what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these 2 poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, put themselves to bed, they start talking about how, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with Mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there's a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a plankette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer that you can place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the plankette, and they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the plankette around. So the people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it, and it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out, or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with Mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board. They go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the plankette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, hey Mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the plankette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute and they try again. Mom, if you're here with us right now, please anything. Just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again, for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they sort of believe is, like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the plankette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believe they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom, but, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, Mom really is gone. So they packed up their YA board, very frustrated. And they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed, and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time, and the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep, and so they're laying in their bedrooms. It's totally dark, it's quiet. And as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere, either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But at first the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. Just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night, the sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what, but they seemed sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really a consistent tapping sound, it was more sporadic. But it was consistently sporadic, like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out, and so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway, she comes into Tina's bedroom, and she goes up to her big sister and she's like, "Do you hear that tapping sound?" And Tina's like, "Yeah, what is that?" And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway, they can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, "Wait a minute, what if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her?" And so feeling sort of excited, all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, "Mom, is that you down there?" And immediately, there's a response. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting the tap 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 response, one of the girls asks another question. "Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you. Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs, and the girls 100% believe it's their mother. And again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom. And even though some of their questions were really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, 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 tap response. Like again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor in there, hearing this tapping and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. They open up the basement door and they're asking more questions. They're getting those tap responses, and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom. They weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement, follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be Mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It was great. And eventually after, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her. Now Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying. But he also knows his girls. They're going through this horrible time in their lives. I mean, they've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. I mean, he's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited. And they're telling him the tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all the stuff, he just goes, You know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She'll always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house. I'm sure of it. And so the girls there, they're so happy again. This was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed. This is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms and they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it again. He's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? So Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue. And they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen. They were coming sometimes from the second floor. They were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over. But Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all. But he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy. Clearly this is their coping mechanism. So again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's Mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is Mom, this is positive, this was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping, because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets, and it was frightening. And they would call their dad in, and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's Mom anymore. They don't know what this is, and it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now, it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. It's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls, hey, come on. Guys, come on. There's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. There's nothing that's gonna harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You gotta let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, like, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's Mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit, and now that evil spirit is haunting our house. So Frank at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. Like, these tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head, or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds. And Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so, fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is now this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. Like, when Dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it was too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls. Because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion, as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're gonna have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available, and so they're home at their house alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift, and the girls, they're in their kitchen, just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here, and they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not, like, this horribly frightening thing. It was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night that the girls are alone, Dad's gone, Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate. Because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us. And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is. But she doesn't want to be away from her sister, and so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen. She goes to the door to the basement. Karen follows right behind her, and Tina, she opens up the door and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps in there in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a dank, sort of open nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like, every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just cause their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom, and they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was a washing machine or something, cause that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated them. And then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary now. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now here we are, a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like, prepared to see something that is making this sound, cause it's real for them. Like, maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house. There has to be something because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement, and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so, after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife. She's like, Karen, let's get out of here. Like, this isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so, the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see on the way down. Written in red on the wall are the words, "I'm in your closet. Come find me." And when the girls see that, they are horrified and they sprint up the stairs. They bolt out of their house, they go to their neighbor's house, start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God. We had this seance, we've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's writing on the walls. We don't know what's going on." The neighbor is so confused, really doesn't understand what's happening, and he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house. You're safe here. We'll wait for your dad to come home. He'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical. They go into the neighbor's house, they shut the door, and they wait. And then a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over, and he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over, they said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank at this point in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in this house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion the girls are sort of acting out. And so Frank alone goes back to his house. He opens up the door, he goes inside, he searches the house, and he looks everywhere. But there's nobody in the house. He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet. Come find me." But it's written in ketchup. And so after again, searching the whole house and finding nothing other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house and he talks to his girls. And he's not mad at them. In some ways, he feels like all of this is basically his fault, like he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning. And he let it get to this point. And so he tells his girls like, "Look, I know that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's playing out that started with, something good. You thought it was Mom, but now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house is haunted. And I'm very worried that this is a product of grief. Like, grief is leading you to do these things, and it needs to stop. And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have done this from the beginning. So we're going to make that happen right now." Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds. But they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them. Like Sharo, and it was not going to change. And on some level, they think maybe there's truth to what he's saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced themselves of things that are not real. And so, in this sort of vulnerable moment, when the girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard, they just tell their dad. Let's just tell their dad. Fine. Whatever. We'll go to grief counseling. And so, sure enough, the next day, the girls would start grief counseling. And right away, all the tapping in the house, all the writing on the walls, all that stuff stopped. Peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8th, 1996. So this is 3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and in those 3 weeks, the Bowen household is totally calm. There's no more tapping, nothing. Everything is fine. But on December 8th, Frank, along with his 2 girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend Kathleen, they had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household. And when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside. Frank goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks that's weird. I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on. But he's like, no, that's weird. So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture on the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. Like if you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen. He's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You gotta remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. You know, with the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house. And he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. He's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught, On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins, like, walking into the house sort of nonchalant, like not really sure how to react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on. And the two daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real. It's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off. He's walking around. Turns the radio off. He's moving furniture back around. And he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search again. All three girls, the two daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank, cause they're so scared. They do the search of the second floor. Nobody there. They search the attic. Nobody there either. They go down to the basement. Nobody in the basement. Like, there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search just. It was just a front room of the house, right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it, cause he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room. And then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room. And this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just you walk in, there's windows, there's the front of the house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away, he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me?" And so Frank, he walks over to the words and he's staring at them being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls again are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs. And he's staring, and as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in the room. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet. And out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls, who are so shocked they're just in silence staring back at this guy. And this person looks at Frank and goes, "You and the girls go upstairs." And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go, Go up the stairs. Do what he says." And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, "Go ahead, girls. First bedroom. Go in the first bedroom." So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom, so Kathleen, Karen, Tina, and then Frank, he goes into the bedroom. And the maniac is right here in the hallway, about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut. And there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in. There's this vicious struggle. And Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second-floor window. And so she smashes to the ground. She runs next door to that neighbor's house. She slams on the door. The neighbor comes out, and Tina's screaming about, "There's someone in my house." So the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency. They call the police, and then minutes later, the police show up. And when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household, and Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second-floor bedroom, and he's screaming to the police, "Hey, there's somebody in here. He was just at my door. He's gone. I don't know where he is." And police, they get over, they put a ladder up to the window. Frank comes down, they get the other two girls down, so everybody is safely out of the house. Now they've been moved over to that neighbor's house. Now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police, they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property top to bottom. And they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide well, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here all. So they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, "Look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so, for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens. See if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property, and we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here, because we don't know what's going on here." And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Nobody went in or out of the Bowen household. And despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on. And so effectively, this person had a disguise on. There was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town, there were no leads, and nobody has come to this house. And they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Basically, nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, "You know what? It'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house." Because basically, they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's gotta be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank by himself goes over to his house. And it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property. And he can tell the officer, "Hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff." And they would. let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking like, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7. Like, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there. But he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. Frank's thinking to himself like, wait a minute. Are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house. I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, you know what? Just in case, I need to call the police. 'Cause I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone and he calls the police. And he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside. And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way. Or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon. And you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay. He hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover. But nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door. He opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor. And the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like, the knives are still sticking into the photo. And where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, I'm going to kill you, Tina, or I'm going to kill you, Karen. And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house. He calls for reinforcements. And so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in out of this house. Or they're still here and we have to find them. Like, clearly the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly, that must have happened because they didn't do this. Somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart looking for this maniac. They look everywhere and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside. And before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up looking for anything, and they found nothing other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing in, the knives. That's all they found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement. And they're just standing there talking to each other like, this is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it? And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his head resting on the washing machine. He's just sitting there like, yeah, what do we miss? What do we miss? And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine. And the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down. And he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement. And it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So Danny LaPlante was 16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently, they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina. And he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had the sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls. Now Danny was not able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house. Like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months, Danny spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls, watching. And he saw an opportunity. He thought, I'm gonna pretend to be their mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here raw. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from it's your mom and it's good to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafson's house. And unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family for really no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly, Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. Danny LaPlante is still alive, and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences. And he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get it. He did not get parole. But during his hearing for his parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system. A quick note about our stories, they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.